and welcome back to Franklin Covey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. That's me. I am privileged, after 6 years and nearly 400 episodes, to still be invited by Franklin Covey to host this podcast, the world's largest podcast dedicated weekly, twice weekly, to leadership. Franklin Covey, of course, you know as the most trusted leadership firm in the world, co-founded by the seminal author, Stephen R. Covey, of the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Franklin Covey helps organizations around the world to build cultures that are steeped in trust, that are more disciplined around executing on your top priorities, that build a more disciplined focus on how you manage your time, your energy, and your attention, which is why today's guest is so perfectly suited to our podcast. Her name is Jessica McCabe. You know her as the YouTube sensation and the author of the book, How to ADHD, an insider's guide to working with your brain, not against it. Jessica, welcome to On Leadership.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
It's great to have you here because I think we all know that everyone now has some level of attention deficit, whether you have a formal diagnosis or you don't. I don't know anybody that's not suffering from an onslaught of attention demand. And I think you're going to be a great conversationalist today to talk about what is it like to have an ADHD diagnosis? How do you thrive within that? How do those around you thrive working with you or for you or married to you or being parented by you? I also think you'll be a great guide to us to kind of understand, how do you know if you actually have an ADHD diagnosis? How do you get one? And how do you just know if you're a person without that's not maybe neurodiverse, that is just dealing with daily life as well? So we'll talk a lot about this. First, I'd love to have you rewind a bit because really you started with this amazing YouTube channel. There's a great story in how that was built and how that came now to be in print form with the book, How to ADHD. Rewind us and talk about your media journey.
Yeah, so I started by failing at life, just epically bad, to the point where I was like, this is not working. At 30, 31, 32 years old, I was broke, divorced, living at home with my mom. I had ruined my credit. My career was going nowhere. Just nothing in my life was going well. I got married, but I was divorced within a year. So I had unpaid parking tickets stuffed into my car. Just like I was a hot mess, frankly. And something clicked for me that year where I realized I was no longer this person with so much potential. I'd been told that I was so gifted growing up. I had so much potential. If only I tried harder. You have so much potential. And after 32 years, I was like, I don't think I'm somebody with so much potential anymore. I'm quickly becoming somebody who hasn't reached it. I realized there was an expiration date on this potential, right? You die, right? Like at that point, you're not going to reach your potential. But even before then, people were going to stop investing in me and stop believing in me. And I was starting to stop believing in me. And what's worse is I had been putting in the effort. I had been trying harder. I'd been doing everything that everybody recommended that I do to be successful. And I was still failing. I felt like I was trying so much harder than everyone around me. And I just kept falling farther and farther behind. And so I did something kind of remarkable, which is I stopped. I decided to stop trying for a little bit. And rather than put all this effort into trying to be successful and trying to reach my potential, I would put that same level of energy and effort into figuring out why I wasn't, what was getting in my way. And the only clue I had at the time was I had this thing called ADD. And so I decided to start learning about it. Maybe there was something more to it than you get distracted and meds help you focus. And so I started learning about it. And it turns out, there was a lot more to it. And I decided to put everything that I learned on YouTube where I could actually find it again. Because I lose notebooks, I lose planners, I lose phones. I would lose my head if it wasn't attached. My mom would tell me growing up, YouTube was the only thing I wouldn't lose. So I decided to put my effort into making these videos, put this information out there, and make it public in case if it was helpful for anybody else. And it turns out it was.
Jessica, it seems like there has been an evolution where we talk about this now as ADHD. You rarely hear ADD anymore. Is there a distinct difference? Has kind of the conversation moved to ADHD from what you understand, not as a clinician, but all of your firsthand research and living it? What's the difference between ADD and ADHD?
Well, the first thing that I learned when I decided to look into ADD is that it's not called ADD anymore. It's called ADHD. they used to distinguish between ADD and ADHD, and ADD was essentially the primarily inattentive presentation of what we now understand is still ADHD. So it's a very confusing name. It's not the best name in the world, but it's ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The reason it's not a great name, there's not actually an attention deficit. This is actually incorrect. It's difficulty regulating our attention. But also you don't have to be hyperactive to have it. And so I found out, even though I wasn't, from my understanding at the time, I wasn't hyperactive like my brother. My brother had been diagnosed with ADHD. I still had it. And then now there's also combined type, but it's all under this umbrella, the umbrella of ADHD. There's primarily inattentive presentation, primarily hyperactive impulsive. And then there's what I and most people with ADHD have, which is combined type. You would qualify for both diagnoses. You are dealing with inattention, but also impulsivity and hyperactivity. And it just can show up differently in girls and women, so it often does get missed.
Jessica, tell us, how does someone know that they probably should be tested? And what does be tested look like? I mean, how does the normal person, I say normal meaning colloquially, that feels like they are struggling with their attention, with regulating their attention management, how does someone know, maybe this is serious enough to where I ought to put some more time and effort into this and maybe go through a series of tests or assessments to determine if I am or not, so at least I can make some decisions on how best to manage it or not manage it?
Yeah, well, you already named the first thing, which is it's serious, right? So if it's something that's impacting your life on a day-to-day basis, then that might be something worth looking into. If it's serious, but it's only been happening since you had a kid, or it's only been happening since you changed jobs, that's probably not ADHD, right? ADHD is a chronic, it's lifelong condition for the most part. So if it's something that you've been struggling with your whole life and it's impacting your life on a day-to-day basis, and you notice that other people don't seem to struggle as much as you do, then I think it's worth looking into. Because here's the truth. The things that people with ADHD struggle with are things that everybody struggles with. Sometimes everybody loses their keys. Everybody gets distracted. Everybody's got a lot of demands on their attention and might get pulled away from their goals. Everybody struggles with these things sometimes. It's the extent to which people with ADHD struggle with it that really makes the difference.
What can you tell us about the process of actually the diagnosis of ADHD? Is it a scale? Is it a yes or a no? Is it a series of tests? Walk through what someone might expect if they decide to go further. And what does that look like? And then what are the ways in which it's being treated?
One way I've heard it described right now is it's a bit of a wild, wild west, because we used to think that ADHD was something that was only a childhood condition. So you'd go to your pediatrician, or you would go to a psychiatrist or somebody to diagnose that in kids. But in adults, there actually are no formal guidelines for the diagnosis and treatment of adult ADHD, because it's still something that we're just beginning to understand as well as we do. So there is an organization that's working on formal guidelines, but because there are no formal guidelines right now, the truth is it's going to depend. It will depend on the type of professional you go see, what that process is going to look like, and it will also depend on that individual person's biases. So I've been to doctors that will not prescribe stimulant medication at all. They're not comfortable with it. They have a lot of myths and misconceptions still bouncing around in their brains about how it works. And then others are really, really well educated, and they have, they've done extra development on the understanding of ADHD in adults, and they're really, really good. So it's a mixed bag. So the first thing I would say is go to a doctor, you go to a nurse practitioner, you can go to a psychiatrist, you can go to a psychologist. There's all kinds of professionals that can diagnose ADHD, but then listen to your gut. If they dismiss you, a great thing to do is ask why. So if they're like, no, this isn't ADHD, this is just depression, or no, it's not ADHD, or it's just anxiety, or no, it's not ADHD, this is just, normal, that everybody struggles like this. Cool. What makes you say that? Like, what is making you rule out ADHD? Because it's not like a pregnancy test. You don't pee on a stick and it's like, yes, you definitively have this, right? It's really, it depends on the practitioner. They have to have a conversation with you. There are scales. You take these tests, you go in and you fill out, these scales. I actually got to visit Connor's rating scales in person, and it was really cool to talk through it with them about how they actually rate these scales, how they develop them. And they're pretty sophisticated, but it's an art more than a science. It's not perfect. And so a lot of it is the psychologist or the nurse practitioner or whatever is also doing their best to assess what's going on with you. So you're self-reporting these symptoms, but they also might, ask to see your report cards from when you were a kid, or talk to your partner and see what their outside perspective is. They will also just have a conversation with you about what you're struggling with. And at the end, hopefully what you get is an accurate diagnosis. But it can be really hard, especially in adults, to pick apart what's what, because people who are depressed also have a hard time focusing, right? People who are super anxious or have PTSD might also have attentional difficulties or emotion dysregulation, which is a big aspect of ADHD. So it can be really complex trying to get an accurate diagnosis, get that assessed and picked apart. But it's really, really critical that you do. I think it's really important to understand any piece of equipment that you work with on a regular basis and understand how it works so that you can work with it more effectively. So while it can be a little tough to get an accurate diagnosis, it's well worth it when you do.
That was extremely valuable, because I think people, if you listen to it carefully, you know what to ask and what to look for. You mentioned emotional dysregulation in that series. Talk about what that is. It's a term I've actually heard quite frequently the last couple of months. What's emotional dysregulation?
Yeah, so emotion dysregulation in ADHD, basically emotions will pop up for us the same way that they would somebody without ADHD, without emotion dysregulation. But for us, being able to regulate those emotions after they pop up is the challenge. So a good example is road rage, right? Like if you're driving down the freeway and somebody cuts you off, somebody who's neurotypical, who is not experiencing emotion dysregulation, might still get angry, right, that they got cut off. But then they take a second, they take a deep breath, they go, okay, well, that truck did have to get over. Maybe I wasn't, leaving him enough room or whatever. Their initial emotion softens a little bit, or maybe it changes to a different emotion. Maybe now they're feeling empathy for this truck driver. Whereas somebody with ADHD will have trouble regulating that initial emotion. So they'll be just as angry. And they might take that deep breath, but before they take that deep breath, they've already, laid on the horn and sped around them and flipped them off, right? Like by the time they even get a chance to regulate that initial emotion, they've already impulsively acted on that emotion. So emotional impulsivity is a part of emotion dysregulation, but also just being able to let go and slow down and temper the initial emotion can be really hard. So what that ends up feeling like for somebody with ADHD is emotions hit hard, they hit fast, we react with raw emotion a lot of the time, and we have trouble getting back down to our baseline.
You've just described my marriage. My wife is going to love this interview, actually. You talk about the whole chapter you dedicate to executive function in the brain. Will you take a couple of minutes to kind of level set? How is an ADHD brain maybe working differently than a non-ADHD brain, and what is the role that executive function has, and how is it impacted with an ADHD diagnosis?
Oh boy, I already did this work, so I'm just pick up my book real quick.
Page 77. Page 77. You dedicate a whole chapter.
Oh wow, look at you. Yeah.
Well, you dedicate a whole chapter,
function.
which is why I was interested, because I think, everyone can learn from this, especially parents, right? In terms of understanding the role that executive function plays in our relationships, our decision making, and how we lead people.
Yeah, I feel like listeners of this podcast will appreciate this. So executive function is essentially a leader. It's the CEO of the brain. It's the part of your brain that's responsible for planning and prioritizing and sustaining effort toward long-term goals. It largely exists in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is the last part of your brain to develop. For most people, that part of the brain develops by the age of 25, which is probably why that's when when you're allowed to rent a car for the first time. It's the stuff that we It's the stuff that we associate with adulting. And that part of the brain and those executive functions are impacted by ADHD. So there's different executive functions that make up our executive function as a whole. But yeah, it's a set of top-down cognitive processes that directs our brain to do the things that we want to do so that we can accomplish the things in life that we want to accomplish. And that, again, is impaired by ADHD. So, we tend to struggle with things like set shifting and response inhibition. We have a harder time with delayed gratification a lot of the time. We often, we're impulsive, and we we're motivated by different things a lot of the time. People with ADHD are motivated by things that are urgent rather than things that are important, things that are stimulating, so things that are new or novel, things that are of personal interest. Those are the things that tend to motivate our brain. The things that are important in life often are long-term goals, and we have trouble with that delayed gratification. And if our brains are not getting the stimulation that they need, then we'll often find it in ways that are not super helpful.
So I know you're not a clinician or a neuroscientist, although you have a tremendous amount of research done in the book and great references and resources. Any advice you would give people that may have just resonated with what you just said around executive function, but may not, for whatever reason, feel like they have ADHD, want to take that formal step, want a diagnosis, want to self-medicate or medicate, not self-medicate, medicate? Are there any practices or tips or habits or insights you might share for someone who's feeling like their executive function isn't managing their life how it should be?
Yeah, so the biggest thing is knowing that everybody's executive function is limited. We can only manage so much. We can only juggle so much. And that's true of anybody. And somebody with ADHD might struggle a little bit harder, but it is true for everybody that at some point the demands on our executive function can overwhelm our ability to cope. So one of the best things you can do for yourself is scale back. Start saying no to some things. Be careful how many long-term projects you have on your plate at any given time, because that requires a lot of management, a lot of set shifting and things like that. If you delegate entire areas of responsibility as opposed to individual tasks. There's a really, really great system that my partner and I just started using called Fair Play. There's a fantastic book on that, and there's a card deck that goes with it where you figure out what areas of responsibility you want to take on within your relationship at home, and you figure out which cards you're holding and which cards your partner is holding. And you don't say like, oh, hey, babe, can you unload the dishwasher? You say, hey, you're in charge of dishes, right? So you're offloading an entire area of responsibility, which means that's less for you to have to manage. If a CEO is trying to run 15 companies at the same time, that's not going to go well for anybody, right? And so that's one of my top tips is get stuff off your plate. If you're struggling to manage, cut down on what you're having to manage.
Jessica, let's talk about the different roles we play in life. I'm gonna pitch you a series of statements, and I want you to fill them in. If you are in a relationship, married, partnership, spouse, partner, and you suspect your partner has ADHD, but yet it's undiagnosed, how best to deal with that?
Oh gosh, this is such a delicate question. It depends. It really depends on how you think your partner might receive it. But there's a fabulous researcher, Dr. Ari Tuckman, who did a book called ADHD After Dark. He wanted to know how ADHD impacted sex lives. And what he found was that the single most important thing to improve somebody's sex life if they have ADHD is to treat the ADHD. Because there's an unfortunate dynamic that can happen. Because there's this unfortunate dynamic that can happen when you have undiagnosed ADHD in a relationship where the non-ADHD partner or the treated, the diagnosed and treated ADHD partner can end up parenting the undiagnosed partner with ADHD. And that's not a great situation for anybody. Parenting a partner kills passion. It's not great for the relationship. It breeds resentment on the part of the person who's parenting, and it makes the other person feel not respected, incompetent, like sometimes give up. So it's a really, really problematic dynamic, but it's one that happens all the time. And so remembering that if your partner does have ADHD, but it's not you versus your partner's struggles, it's both of you up against those struggles. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition. It's really well researched at this point. We know that there are specific challenges that go along with it, and it's not weird that your partner is struggling. Given this diagnosis, it would be weird if they weren't. So what are you going to do about it? I think that it's really important to support, accommodate, treat ADHD. And what you're aiming for is optimal treatment, which may or may not include medication. But for a lot of people with ADHD, it does.
You mentioned parenting in the role of a relationship, but talk about formal parenting in terms of, someone like me and my wife and I rather, that are parenting 3 young boys that are 10, 12, and 14. There's a lot going on there, my friend. What advice would you have for parents when it comes to watching for signs or maybe not overstepping and branding their kid as ADHD, because we know the impact that labels can have on a child's self-esteem and their self-confidence. What advice would you give to parents who might be either suspecting their child might be struggling with this, or they have a diagnosis and they're still having difficulty parenting?
I mean, talk to professionals first. So talk to their teachers. Teachers get to see a lot of different kids. So for you, it might seem normal that your 10-year-old is struggling with something, especially if you yourself has ADHD. ADHD is highly genetic. So if you're like, well, this is normal kid stuff. I struggled with this too at his age. Cool. Are the other kids in that class struggling? That's something that you might want to ask the teacher, because they have a better insight into what's typical for that age range. If you are expecting a 5-year-old to sit through a college lecture and you're like, well, they're not paying attention at all. Of course they're not, right? A college lecture is not developmentally appropriate. But there is a neurodevelopmental delay that happens with ADHD. And so sometimes we're expecting a lot of a 10 or 12-year-old with ADHD compared to what they are currently capable of doing. Maybe they would succeed in a grade a couple of grades down in terms of the level of executive function that's expected of them. But they're struggling here because they're expected to manage a lot more than they are currently able to. So there's a lot of supports that you can put in place there. Organizational skills training is something that I wish I had personally had. Treatment, medication. But in terms of looking for signs, talk to their teachers, talk to their doctor if it's a concern, if it's something you're worried about. But what you said about labels, I want to address that, because that's something that a lot of parents are worried about, right? Is this label? I don't want to label my kid, but really what they're saying a lot of the time is, I don't want my child to be limited. And I will say this, when I began to understand my ADHD and I learned how my brain works, that did not limit me. That empowered me, because now I understood how to read the error codes in my own brain, and I had strategies and tools. When I did not have that, I still got labels, but the labels were not helpful. The labels were messy and lazy and spacey and stupid, and just a lot of really, really awful labels that people gave me to explain why I was doing why I was acting the way that I was acting. Like, oh, well, she's just super messy Jessie, right? Like, I was still labeled. Your kid is still being labeled. The key is to find the accurate labels that are going to be helpful for them so that they can work with their brain, not against it.
What advice would you give to, say, an individual producer in a company who may be working for a leader and they suspect or feel that their leader has ADHD, and maybe they do or they don't, and they haven't disclosed it, or it's untreated, or it is being treated but not treating it effectively? Any advice you would give to a team member who thinks their boss has ADHD and it's causing conflict in their career, and their relationship, and their stature in the company, and their productivity? Take that anywhere you'd like to go.
That's a really good question. I don't recommend being like, hey, you have ADHD to people. Like, diagnosing other people is not generally a good practice. But what you could do is speak openly about it if it's something that you struggle with or something that you know about and you understand. Just talking about it a lot of the time is enough for people to start self-suspecting. There are a ton of people who are adults with ADHD who didn't know that they had ADHD because either they had misunderstandings of it, like they thought that there had to be an attention deficit, right? That's a big one. Parents will be like, oh, well, my kid can't have ADHD. Like, he can sit and play video games for 8 hours. Like, he can focus when he wants to, right? But it's not an attention deficit. It's an attention regulation issue. And so if I were to have a boss like that, I might talk about how sometimes I'm able to focus really, really well on something to the point where I'm in a really deep flow and you can barely pull me away. And sometimes I am going to get distracted by everything. So talking about ADHD a little bit more helps break down some of the myths and misconceptions. And just by speaking about your own personal experience, a lot of the time people resonate with that. And I can't tell you how many people have been diagnosed with ADHD just because I went on a YouTube channel and started talking about ADHD and how it impacts me. There were so many people going, oh, this sounds really familiar. Like, this is a thing? Huh.
So let's talk about that. You mentioned the YouTube channel. Obviously, your book and the channel work kind of hand in glove. Will you give us some more insights around what people might expect if they were to go to the channel, subscribe to it? I mean, 1.7 million subscribers. Congratulations. You have dedicated how many years to this channel?
8 years now.
8 years. Talk about a focus. Talk about disciplined attention. Riff a little bit on what's going on in the channel. What do people expect to get? Why are you still at it? Take that wherever you'd like to go.
One of the reasons that I'm able to keep doing what I do after 8 years is because projects are short term for the most part. The book was tough. I had to pull out pretty much every tool in my toolbox to be able to get through a book. But for the most part, when I started, it was one video a week, and I would get to learn something new every week, and I would get to Google, and I would get to put together what I'd learned, and then put it out on the internet for everybody to see, and I would get that immediate feedback. Immediate positive feedback is really, really motivating for ADHD brains. Short-term projects can be really great. Anything urgent with a deadline, that can be really, really wonderful. I don't remember the question at this point. Could you? Sorry.
Well, so I was just asking you to talk about what would people experience on the YouTube channel?
Right.
What kind of content do you deliver? Why do people go visit it?
Yeah. So if people go to the YouTube channel, you can actually see from the beginning. You can go watch the entire playlist from the beginning of every video that I've ever made if you really want to. You can learn as I learned. And I started knowing nothing, really. Everything that I learned of value about ADHD, I learned and I put on the channel. So you can go back and watch the really early cringy videos all the way through my more nuanced conversations now. But I've got a few different types of videos on the channel. I have what I call my lecture style videos, which is I did a deep dive into understanding the science behind a struggle and a strategy that can help. And those videos are often animated or have a lot of visual interest, quick cuts, things like that to kind of keep our attention. And then I have deeper conversations, either with other experts or sometimes just on my own. I will do a vlog style video just talking about something that I learned or something that I found. And one of the ones that I'm more proud of is I did a video talking about how my channel was kind of like ableist when I started. I started out thinking it was just fundamentally better, and this is how I was supposed to be, right? I was supposed to function like a neurotypical human. I was supposed to have neurotypical goals and pursue them. And it was okay that I had to work with my brain a little differently, but I still had to be on time and have my car clean and my house organized and all these goals that were really passed on to me from this neurotypical society of this is how you're supposed to live and this is how you're supposed to be. And I kept waiting to be this, put together, organized, on time version of myself, and then I would be successful. And it turns out I ended up being successful before I got there. It turns out you don't have to be. People do grow, but they grow along their own growth lines. And so you can kind of see my personal growth on this channel of learning to accept who I am and learning to accept my challenges and learning to accept that it's not just that I need different tools or to maybe do things differently, but maybe my life is going to look a little bit different than I thought it quote unquote should. And that's okay.
You also dedicate a whole chapter in the book about making ADHD harder. What are some of the accelerants, if you will, if someone does have an ADHD diagnosis, or they don't, but they still, possess a neurodiverse brain that's not working like a non-ADHD brain? What are some of the, are there foods, are there environmental factors, are there personalities, are there stimulants that, like light or sound or others? Are there any things that you might say, gosh, you might want to steer clear of these things, whether you are diagnosed or you are undiagnosed, because they can act as an accelerant or an inhibitor or maybe like a force multiplier in a bad way, if you will, making your ADHD harder?
That was really my intersectionality chapter. It's harder to have ADHD if you are also a woman of color, because you are going to be judged on multiple fronts, right? And I hear from Black women with ADHD all the time. They feel like they have to avoid not only just being emotionally dysregulated at work like anybody would, but also there's this trope of the angry Black woman that they have to avoid. So they have to be extra good or work extra hard. So being a woman, being of color, being trans, being, there's a lot of things that we didn't get to choose about ourselves that are going to make our presentation more complicated, or is going to make the judgments that society levels against us a little harsher. And we have to work extra hard at overcoming that. I don't even want to say overcoming, as I don't think it's something that you can overcome, but we have to combat that a little bit harder. We have to put more energy into it. But there are some things that matter in terms of what would make ADHD easier or harder, that we do have some control over. Being in the right job is game changing.
Yeah.
Having a job that allows us to lean into our strengths and mitigate our challenges is really, really critical in terms of how successful we're going to be. The same things that I'm really good at my job now that make me successful, I've gotten fired for at other jobs because apparently you're not supposed to be on the computer and Google everything that pops into your head at certain jobs. But I did. I'm a curious person and I love to learn, and that benefits me now, but it got me fired then. So having the right job really makes a difference. And even in the right job, having an environment that is set up in a way to support you, to support your brain, makes a big difference. If I had my video game console in my office with me, I would not be as productive. I try to tailor my environments to what it is I'm trying to accomplish, and I try to set myself up for success. I try to do things that will help me stay on task if it's something where I need to stay on task. And other times I know that I want to be creative, so I might actually intentionally put things in my environment that I can use to pull myself off task and let my brain wander a little bit and come up with more creative ideas. So environmental factors are really huge. In terms of diet can have an impact. It tends to be overblown. You are not, I'm so sorry to say, you are not going to cure your kids' ADHD or your ADHD by taking away their candy. It's not going to happen. It doesn't work that way. And also eating a certain way can be really tough for people with ADHD. And I just want to elaborate on that for a second. There are a lot of strategies that can be helpful for somebody with ADHD that are really difficult to implement because of the executive function challenges involved. So yes, like if my diet was a certain way, it might be good for my ADHD, but also being able to meal prep and go shopping and cook and do all these things, that's actually really tough for me. So I will do a lower lift version of that, which is I try to make sure that I have protein with every meal, and I leave it at that. But there's so many little things that you can do that can make life with ADHD easier or harder, but the really big ones are surround yourself with people who understand, and who are supportive, and learn about it, learn how to work with your brain, not against it, and try to find the right job for you, because the right job you might be wildly successful at. The wrong job, you might get fired on the first day. That's happened to me too. I have been fired on day one from some jobs. So environmental factors make a really big difference.
I think that's actually refreshing advice, because you're exactly right. Is when you are an adult, whether you are in the right fit, the right position, the right company, the right industry, the right role, the right culture, under the right leader, I don't think we give ourselves enough latitude to realize this isn't right for me, right? A lot of people make career decisions based on need or necessity or guilt or debt or fear. And especially for people who are dealing with ADHD, it's probably even more consequential to pick the right role. Have you researched or uncovered that there are certain types of roles or industries, I know it's a broad question, that people with ADHD should either steer away from or perhaps even magnetize towards because they're just naturally better aligned with someone that has their style of neurodiversity, if you will?
It's going to vary depending on a lot of things, but what your personal interests are is going to have a huge part to do with it. But in general, short-term projects, things where you have to be kind of on point in the moment, but planning and prioritizing and things like that are not as much of a part of your job, can be really good. So a lot of people who are like ER doctors are fantastic, or nurses. A lot of people like to have flexibility so that they can work when they want to work, when their brains are functional that day. Like we have good brain days and bad brain days, and so some people really like the flexibility of being able to work when it makes sense for them to work. So like gig industries can be really great. We tend to be really creative, so creative industries we often do well at. But I think it's less about the exact role and more about the goodness of fit with what are you doing on a day-to-day basis, and is that something that you gravitate toward or away from? Because that gear grinding, I don't like what I'm doing, frankly, neurotypical people can get past that. If it's like, well, this is good for my career, this is gonna be good for my family, they can get past that. People with ADHD, it's gonna be absolutely disabling, frankly. Like even if we can get through a day that gear grinding, I don't want to do this, but I'm making myself, it actually contributes to more aversion and more procrastination in the long run, because we learn that this is a horrible experience, which makes it harder for us to drag ourselves back to our desk and get ourselves to do it again tomorrow.
Jessica McCabe, star of the YouTube channel How to ADHD and author of the book by the same name, An Insider's Guide to Working with Your Brain and Not Against It. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. These are great questions.
I appreciate your time. I can assure you that everybody that's listening and watching around the world has someone in their life that they're thinking about right now, perhaps including themselves, that they might choose to take a little more proactive step towards understanding how to manage or unleash the talent that even comes from having an ADHD brain. And your book, How to ADHD, and its podcast are two great tools. Appreciate having you on today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.